Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining this session about OSPO, Open Source Program Offices. So I'm Boris Baldassari. I work for the Eclipse Foundation as an open source consultant, and during this roundtable, we'll discuss OSPOs, Open Source Program Offices, the OSPO Alliance, and how to define and build an OSPO within an organization. Maybe we can start with just a definition of what an OSPO is. So Open Source Program Office is a team within an organization that helps with anything open source within the organization. So that includes the ins, what we consume, the outs, what we produce. It's also about the training from the developers to the executives, bringing up a culture about open source within the organization. And it's really a strong trend these last years with many organizations from SMEs to big corporations and administrations creating their OSPO. And it's not easy, so for many of these companies, it's not easy to just know where to start. They probably never dealt with open source before, and they now realize that they have something like 80% of their code that uses some open source at some point. So they start thinking, maybe I should manage that properly, and they want to build an OSPO. That's not necessarily easy for them. That's where the OSPO Alliance come into the picture. So in 2021, a group of European not-for-profit organizations founded the OSPO Alliance. And that's a safe place to come and discuss anything OSPOs, bring their experience, share their experience, good practices, mistakes. So that's it. The OSPO Alliance is composed of the ospo.zone website. We have a mailing list where people can safely discuss about OSPOs and anything open source. We also have monthly webinars, the OSPO on-ramps. So you can join really easily. There is no barrier, no fees, no commitments. You just have to sign a letter of support for the OSPO Alliance initiative to be part of to be a member of the group. And we started, so in 2021, a handbook about best practices to how to define and build an OSPO within an organization. We published the first version of the Good Governance Initiative handbook last year in November, so that was for the open source experience as well. And we have published this year, so today, the 1.1 version, so with a few upgrades to the handbook and translations in different languages, and also a quick and easy deployment feature, so to help people just start their OSPO within the organization in something like 10 minutes. On a GitLab instance, you create everything you need, and starting from there, you can define your roadmap and start making progress on it. To discuss OSPOs, we have a bunch of experts, nice experts there. I'll start with Silona Bonewald. So she's the executive director for IEEE SA Open, a comprehensive platform offering the open source community cost-effective options for developing and validating their projects. She was previously VP of Community Architecture at Hyperledger, a global open source collaborative effort hosted by the Linux Foundation, where she integrated leaders in finance, banking, Internet of Things, supply chains, and manufacturing. So thank you, Silona, for coming. Gaël Blondelle is the managing director of the Eclipse Foundation Europe and VP Ecosystem Development of the Eclipse Foundation. Gaël has been involved in the open source community and ecosystem for more than 16 years and is the co-chair of the program committee of the Open Source Experience 2022. Christian Paterson is an open source strategy and community expert. He is currently an independent consultant for OpenUp. He shares the OW2 Quick App initiative and he's a VP at OW2 board. Previously head of the open source governance for the Orange Telecom Group, he participated to the steering committee of the French Systematics Open Source Hub. Pierre-Yves Gibello is an entrepreneur and research engineer involved in IT for more than 30 years, including 25 in open source. He is a contributor to many open source projects, an expert for French Public Innovation Agency OSEO. He has been a board member at OW2 for 10 years before joining the foundation in 2019 and becoming the OW2's CEO in 2022. Philippe BAREILLE is in charge of the open source policy at the City of Paris and a project manager in innovation at the CIO's office. With a 10-year experience as a software engineer, he is the advocate and representative of Paris' signature city services platform, LUTES, and its new service packs, Cité Libre. He's a long-time passionate about open source software in the public sector in particular, where public money must contribute to financing public code. So thank you for joining this session. So maybe we can start with the basics. So why would organizations nowadays start an OSPO? What are their incentives to do so? Gaël, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first I see some familiar faces. So thanks for joining. But I also see other people. So good to see that this topic is interesting more and more people. Yeah. So I think that we all agree that open source is everywhere. So every organization, every company that is doing development will use open source. And I think that using open source is, of course, the first step in approaching open source. But then there is, at some point, some companies will decide to contribute to open source, to champion some open source projects, or to even lead, have a strategic approach to open source. And I think for all of them, an OSPO, it can be from a dedicated team, or it can be only a few people who will be the focal point. But for all those companies, an OSPO is useful and I could say sometimes necessary. Because even when you start using open source, you need to make sure that your usage of open source is good. You use open source as a good citizen, so you don't make mistakes by mixing incompatible licenses. So there is always, at the beginning, I don't like leading with that, but we must admit that lots of companies start approaching open source from the legal compliance topic, that they want to make sure that they don't create some legal risks for the users of their products or even for the company itself. So I think that that may be the reason why to start with an OSPO, but the role of the OSPO is definitely to do more than that, and to if you start by, okay, we have to do it, then how can we benefit from being an actor in the open source community? So I guess that others will talk about the good governance initiative more, but I think that the five axes of the good governance initiatives are really a good point. Is that the first axis is how to use open source, how to have trust in open source, how to develop an open culture in your company, how to engage with open source, and maybe the big target for everybody should be how to be more strategic about open source.
And indeed, we often hear that the OSPO start with compliance, but at least for the OSPO Alliance and the Good Governance Initiative Handbook, it's a lot more than the compliance. It's really contributing upstream, it's really participating to the community and so on. And Silona, you have been in this field for quite some time. How do you see this trend about OSPOs?
Yeah, so I also see OSPOs moving not just in corporate world either. And one of the things I'm trying to highlight is the fact that I'm here in the arena that's actually really leading on that in regards to open source and government. And looking at that with, we've got the lead here, right? I'm watching, and we also have, like, on our platform, we've got an academic institution, RIT, is actually using it as well. So they have their open source program office and the expansion that's happening. And one of the things that I see for that is that it's going beyond just software. For RIT, for example, when they opened the launch of that office, yes, you expect computer science and those people to come in. but instead they had over 40 different schools come into play in regards to it, where design was interested and film was interested and communication department was interested. And so they ended up being able to integrate all of those other schools in regards to wanting to be more open, whatever that definition of open is. So that's a nice progression that I'm seeing happening.
Please.
Yes, and maybe just to elaborate on one of the points I made earlier, is that the size of an OSPO is that it can really be, maybe your OSPO will be a virtual OSPO with a mailing list of where you have the technical experts on the mailing list being able to answer questions about which project to select in terms of which license, etc. Or maybe you will have a team of, I don't know, for big companies that can be 5, 10, maybe more people that will also help everybody in the company create new open source project, publish new open source project, decide what to open source, where to open source it in terms of should we go to GitHub, should we host it with an open source foundation, etc. So that's really where there's not one size fits all OSPO, but I think that's identifying the function of an OSPO in an organization is very important.
And indeed, thank you for reminding us that, Silona. So that's really not only for companies, that's for every type of organization. That's definitely one of the texts of the OSPO Alliance and the GGI handbook, where we really wanted to target all types of organizations, so from SMEs to big corps to administrations, research labs, and so on. And so then that's an excellent transition, thank you, because we have here Philippe. So my next question would be, how would organizations start implementing the OSPO?
Well, at first, I want to say that the case of Paris was natural. We've been doing open source for more than 20 years, as well as producers, as well as users and reusers. So it was time. We literally started more than 20 years ago. And the tech team was always led by someone very implicated in open source topics and in managing open source as well as you could. But the city took an engagement towards open source, and thankfully, we're very thankful for the elected official at that time that voted at the city council that all the code we would write would be open source. So that being said, it's been a long time love story between the city of Paris and open source, so there's the city engagement. And we relied on a few people that knew all the open source moves, all the strategies, all the behaviors to be a good citizens, as you guys said. But more than that, we are in a bigger step now. We need to be more better professionals to open source. That means understand and see the whole umbrella of what open source covers. It's not only about code, it's about communities, it's about behaviors, it's about culture, it's about having the C-level aware of how important open source is. So it's not only publishing a piece of code saying, okay, it does that, we'll try to keep up with the documentation as well as possible. It's way more than that. It's about, and it covers, and hopefully we worked very hard on this notebook to be as generic as possible. And as you said, it would comply to public organizations as well as private companies, no matter the size, no matter we're an OSPO, we don't call it that way yet. I think we don't. We're pretty cautious about this, but we're an OSPO of one, but with a team of developers of 100 about. So the will of the city of Paris was to engage, to have a better and more professional and a better awareness of how wide this umbrella is. And once these generic activities, to be more specific, were done, we made it ours. So it's a very generic approach, but then you need to implement each activity depending on your activity, depending on your size of a company, depending on your field of activity. So I think this is a very powerful tool to rely on, and is an everyday help that we can rely on, saying, okay, we cannot tackle all these 25 activities that are identified in the notebook up front at the same time. So we have priorities to set. We have main concerns. In a public organization, we have our elected officials that draw the open source policy. We are here to implement it. With this tool, we can make it ours, and depending on their will, on our C-level's will, we can now identify which activity and find ways to measure our progress.
Because you are one of the first organization to actually implement the GGI, and so that was really a great help for us as well when we defined it.
That was a great opportunity for us to help contribute to this, even though our contribution is very light, I must say. But at least we proposed to be a pilot project and to give as much feedback as possible to make it better, to improve it, and to make it great after all. So we actually try to reach out to other public administrations, other cities, to join this, so that way we can also improve, because City of Paris is sometimes bigger than big companies. So in the public sector, we need other administrations, public sector organizations to join and to foster this.
Congrats on this.
Thank you.
Christian and Pierre-Yves, you have been a part of the GGI initiative since the beginning, almost. So what would be your take on how organizations should do to implement and build their roadmap and so on?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with obviously many of the statements my colleagues on the panel have made. I would take a slightly different angle about the OSPO to Gaël. In operational terms, I think it's true that many organizations come at the question of OSPO because they're thinking they need to control risk. But in the absolute purity of the question, I'm going to say like that, I would not approach the creation of an OSPO from that perspective. I would look at what it is your company is hoping to achieve, not with open source, but just generally. What are its business goals? How is open source, or how might open source help achieve those business goals? And then what organization can be put in place to help realize that value? So we have to think of open source as a tool that helps to create value for a business or an organization. Then the question of how do I create an OSPO becomes not one of what is the compliance questions and all of these kind of things. It's about, well, how can I empower and foster the movement towards open source in this pursuit of value. And when I say value, I'm using that word very specifically because the notion of value can be very different depending on your company or your association. It might be that what you're looking to do is to have greater freedom on your choice of suppliers, so the notion of digital sovereignty, and in which case your emphasis around governance and how you want to foster the open source within your initiative is maybe going to look more at what your purchasing departments and teams and software acquisition management are doing. It may be that you're looking at open source because, well, your developers are doing it, they really like it, you think it's a nice way to motivate and also to give recognition to your developers. There's this worldwide community, of course. So, you know, it's a way of attracting, training, motivating, keeping developers, which is obviously more and more important in today's world. So I really look at the question of OSPO creation, not from the perspective of I need to control the line or look at the license aspects, but look at it from the perspective of what is it I'm trying to achieve as a business. How can open source help me, and what is it I need to put in place for that to happen? Now, when I was at Orange, when I took over the governance of the open source, one of the things I did was to actually go and speak with many of the key people or the key players within the organization. I was like, okay, so you guys are doing what? What is it you need? What do you need from us? How can I help you? And they obviously came up with some nice ideas. They came up with the pain points that they're being challenged against. And so using those pain points and those ideas and those needs, you start to create your idea of the different verticals in the sense of what are my functions of OSPO. Now, yes, in big organizations, part of that function is going to be risk mitigation. And you should always think of risk mitigation as a larger subject than purely license compliance. But there are other elements that come into play. And in fact, it was the notion of training that made me speak with Cedric Thomas back in a few years back. And I was saying, and actually I put a tweet out and I put a LinkedIn out, and I was like, you know, who can help me train people to act within an OSPO environment? What exists out there? And this is where we started, and actually there's a co-conspirator in the audience. This is where we started to list out some of the items we thought would be interesting for people to know. And you quickly come to the realization that this is like a never-ending string that you're pulling. It's like, oh yeah, okay, but they need to know, well, what is open source and what is compliance, and there's just so many subjects. And this kind of snowballed into what is now the Good Governance Initiative, which is incredible. So it's, obviously this handbook is the place to go. Let's be clear, if you're looking to create the OSPO. But you know, going back to what I initially said, and I'll hand over to Pierre, is think about what it is you're trying to achieve, because what Orange was trying to achieve and what City of Paris are trying to achieve, it's not the same thing. And it's not the same OSPO.
And it's great to hear that as for some people it's a liability and a risk management thing, it can also be seen as a real opportunity and making it a true asset for the organization. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, but open source should be considered a tool towards value creation. And like any tool, you need to control the risks that are associated with those tools, whatever those risks might be.
Pierre-Yves, OW2 has been involved in the GGI initiative for a long time, and you have a huge experience with open source and organizations and companies. So what would be your take on this?
Yes, thank you. First, we already mentioned the Good Governance handbook. So now it's in English, in French, and also in German. The handbook itself is a methodology, a set of methodology guidelines, very simple ones with 5 levels. The basic level is usage, so people start using open source from scratch. Maybe some admins or some developers start putting some open source in what they do. Then the level above is trust. You obtain trust in open source components because they start running and you start running some operations on them and it works. The step above is confidence. So open source, you start dealing with compliance, licensing, legal issues. So it becomes, you reach a kind of stability in using open source in the organization. Then the level above is engagement. So you start having some governance bodies and some budgets and some kind of organization. It's the first level of what we can really call an OSPO. And then the last one is open source becomes strategic, so it's the strategy level with C-level executives being involved on the open source part of the company strategy. So each level is described. There are some guidelines, but this is just guidelines.
Here's one we made earlier.
You don't need to have this ordered this way. You can enter, maybe it can be a strategist who says we have to go to open source, and then you start from the top, or it can start from the bottom by itself, and you try to manage what happens. I mean, it's not your story. It's a way to it's guidelines to implement it, because open source in your organization is a story you are part of. And what I mean is that whatever your level today, you are already part of the story, because open source is already there. I mean, you have open source components, even if you prefer to purchase contracts on the products off the shelf. Open source is already somewhere on your infrastructures, on your servers, in the software that your developers build every day, in the software supply chain. So it is a kind of choice between being an actor of your life or being running after it day after day. So you have to take open source into account, and you have to build a story that corresponds to what you are, in fact. And this implies, I agree, this implies a lot of changes, because it's not really a classical market. I mean, if you just think that you will purchase open source from big business providers, and they will provide all you need with the contract, and you won't have anything to manage, just forget about it, because it is also about nurturing an ecosystem. It's like agriculture. I mean, if you destroy the soil and don't understand anything, you will produce for some time, but you will destroy the ecosystem, and in the end, all your efforts will be lost. So you have to be part of it, to consider that you work with maybe small companies, and we have some of our use cases here. City of Paris, of course, but also Orange, which was involved in building this governance guide. They have taken some measures to work directly with software providers, with even small companies, to purchase maintenance contracts and to deal with the ecosystem. So it's important. And I should say, it's a story that you will build within a community, and you also will have the community entering your organization, because when you recruit developers today, it's very attractive to propose them open source. I mean, if you want to recruit new talents, open source is important for them. They like that. It gives also some sense and some meaning to their life and to what they do at work. So this gives you also, because these people, they will want to contribute upstream and to be part of the open source movements and of projects. So your organization will get involved in it. I mean, whatever you do, it will happen. So better be aware of it, manage it, think about it, and become part at your own pace, but become part of the ecosystem, become part of the open source movement, become part of the story.
Thank you for this introduction to the presentation of the whole handbook. And excuse me, that's indeed one of the things one of the feedback we had from the GGI handbook, people implementing it. It both helps to define the roadmap. So in the beginning, they didn't even know where to start. So they went through the different activities, some of them being really small or not so small steps, but identify your dependencies and monitor the training that you need, the skills, identify champions, up to making it a strategic asset for the company. And so, which leads to the next question, the next question about the feedback from real life implementation. So that's one thing that you, Philippe, had to do with the City of Paris, because the handbook provides a framework with 25 activities. Not all of them are for all situations. So what was your train of thought and process to really build something that is specific, in fine, to the Ville of Paris, City of Paris?
As you said, 25 activities is a lot. So at first, maybe this is very personal, but when I tend to approach this kind of very wide recommendation book, I would like to go through all of them and then identify their scope, their the item scopes that are like items to understand how wide this is. So once we covered all of those 25 to understand a bit more what is trust, but within the trust pillar, you have 5 activities. Within the, you said confidence, you said
culture, engagement,
culture, thank you, usage. There are always 5 activities depending on those specific pillars. So by contributing to this book, we had a better sense of what was expected. I just want to add a few things on what you just said, Pierre-Yves, is that I often compare this methodology with the Agile one. There are 12 principles of Agile, which make it the manifesto of Agile. But would any one of you implement all 12 of them? I'm sure none of you. We don't, even though we say we are Agile, we follow Agile methodologies. But this handbook covers 25 different activities. We won't do all of them. That's not possible. Our environment doesn't allow it. We're not for-profit, so it makes us a bit different from other contributors. So we have our own specifics. So this is done for everyone, as I said, but it makes it very free for us to use and to rely on, because we know for a fact that we won't tackle all 25 of them, but at least we are aware of them, and this is very important and powerful. So to answer your question, at the City of Paris, we wanted to engage in this even more, spend more time, or assume this time that we would spend on doing it professionally, in a more professional way. So this means understand, make it ours, a methodology based on the generic one, but at least have our own City of Paris version of it. And I brought this to our CIO and said, okay, what would help the most our elected officials in their open source policy? This is a method that would help tackle it, that would help implement it. So she gave me a lot of feedback saying, okay, this is a priority that would tackle this engagement. So please go ahead, put it on, bring it on, and let's measure our progress. Another thing that I think is very important is that once you set it, once you make it yours, you can see that you don't always start from scratch. You already had a culture, an engagement, a trust to open source. So at some point, you may identify activities that are done, that are tackled in your own company, in your own usage of your own understanding of open source. So it is a great way to have like a catalog of things to be done. And sometimes you're like, oh, this one is done, because we've done it unconsciously, because you knew it was needed, you knew it was the way of doing it, but you didn't know how to measure this, how to see progress, how to put figures. But it is done. So, okay, good. We can put a check on that box. Out of those 25, there's a check. Okay, let's move on. So and I finish on this. But we now have our roadmap set, and I was first told when I joined this network that once we would implement it locally, we would have our own roadmap. And yeah, it is true.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to bounce on a couple of points that Philippe said. I think it's really important, that notion of going to the business, saying, what is it you need? How can we address that? Not just because it helps you determine your priorities, because you're completely right, there are way too many activities to do everything. I mean, you know, it doesn't matter how large your organization, you're never going to be able to address all the different things you could or you want to do. But it also gives you a metric, or it allows you to define a metric for how you evaluate your journey along that road. So if you're responding to a need that's coming from the business side of the organization, and you're saying, okay, well, this is what we're going to do to reply to this need, you then implicitly also can start to define the metrics for evaluating that. And I think that's really important as well.
Because you set your own objectives, and
Yeah.
this is very important and powerful.
Yeah.
There are a few examples of objectives that you can set to your own company, but at the end of the day, you define your own. So this is very meaningful.
So it really helps in structuring your thoughts and path to the OSPO source, open source success, without while still enabling you to have your own path. So provides guidance and still have your own path. Yes, Silona, please.
Yeah, so when I was at PayPal, one of the things that I noticed is certain teams, especially if they already came from open source, would automatically be doing a lot of the different things that you'll find in here. But they were lacking like the measurement component or some piece of that, which ended up hurting them. But once we were able to go in and like do a more full picture, especially by engaging with middle management and talking about the strategic initiatives for doing all of this, then we were able to obtain that internal sustainability that we really needed to have. But like, for example, our Android team already was doing much of this because they came over from Android. They were already open source people. They're like, duh, of course we're gonna do it this way. And they already had it all in line. While of course other teams that were a little bit, hadn't been refactored in a long time, did not participate that well. And it took a lot of training and a lot of work. But oftentimes in larger corporations, you can find those bits in there and you can go through and work with them and they can actually help the rest of the company on your journey.
And it's also that value measurement that you can take, whatever it is the metric that you're talking about, and there are a whole ton that can go with open source, I'm going to say OSPO and community building, but it's also those value metrics and how you can evaluate your journey along them that allows you to then move up towards your more senior management to help get buy-in from senior management. Because if there's one thing that you have to have at some point, it's the buy-in from senior management. I mean, OSPOs, they can start from grassroots, and that's a great way to start because you have people who are motivated, who are implicated, who are operationally active. But you have to have the senior management say at some point, this has a value and I support what you're doing. Because if you don't, you're always fighting the battles of, these people don't have the time allocated, or this isn't a priority for us as a group. But yeah, it should be a priority because of A, B, C, D, whatever. But, it's a constant battle. So I can say from past experience, and I'm pretty sure everyone on the panel here agrees, is one of the key factors is as you start to mature your notion of governance and usage around open source, is to determine the leviers that help you get the support from the senior management. Because they're the ones that will set in stone, if you want, the notion of OSPO is good, open source is good, and the change in culture that brings has a value for us.
And yes,
A
quickly,
quick
please.
plug for our book. So right here, with all the different pieces on it, you'll have something very complete that you can take up to senior management if you do these things.
And that was a really good sales speech. Thank you. So to wrap things up, and so we can have a few questions from the audience. A few links. Go to ospo.zone, the ospo.zone website. You will find everything you need from the OSPO NRAMP monthly webinars, the links to the GGI handbook. We are open. We work like an open source project, so it's all open, public, meritocratic. You can just join, come, participate, and get the benefits.
Yes, and I should say, come with your experience. I mean, we are very open to end users. If we could build that, it is because we have people like Orange, like Thales, like Maïf, like City of Paris and others that brought, or like Silona with her experience before at PayPal. Yeah. Yes. So that can tell us what happens really in the trenches on the ground. This allows that we can build together something significant, because each of us has different visions. I mean, me or Gaël, we come from open source communities, but we are not really involved in building on OSPO for end user. I mean. So we bring our vision from open source as a community involved in the story, but the other part and the most important concerning OSPO is the users. So don't be afraid to join if you are not a technical specialist, if you are not an open source or a software engineer. It's not necessary. I mean, if you are a manager from an OSPO or someone involved in the process, it's very interesting to provide us some feedback and some help to build together the next methodology guide.
Gaël, maybe a final word?
Yeah,
1 minute.
Just one word about the OSPO Alliance, not necessarily the GGI. My vision of the OSPO Alliance is that it should have 3 pillars at some point, and one pillar is about discovering open source. So we want some, good resources to explain to your CIO or why open source is a good option. So that's really, the discovering open source pillar. The second pillar is understanding open source, and we'll start in the coming months, in the coming semester, quarters. We will start putting together some training materials, and I think that the last pillar is implementing open source, and that's really where we already have the GGI. So I like this idea that we start from concrete stuff, but we also want to build the other pillars after that. And so everybody should join. That's really free. Like we already said that. Join us.
And now
we are available after to discuss.
Now is a good time, especially so we have our 1.1 release today. We'll start working on the next release, so we do yearly releases. We'll start working on our next iteration, roadmap, and release starting in a couple of weeks. So now is really a great time to join. Thank you all. Maybe we can have some questions from the audience.
Unlikely. It's not already time?
Can we still have a few questions?
There is 1 minute for one question.
Yours.
No, I don't have a question.
Not yours. Yeah. You don't have a question?
No.
We were very
You want
clear.
to moderate the moderator? Thanks. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, I'm Cyril Chausson from IDC. So I heard many things about, OSPO. It's from HR, for example, for compliance, for legal, from IT as well, of course. So do you consider it's a multi-profiles activity? And how do you scale? How do you think you are able to onboard new profile in this OSPO?
First, I would I don't have an OSPO, so I would
Maybe
prefer a city
Just
of Paris,
yeah,
for
yeah, just
example.
point of view actually.
Maybe Philippe or
Just one remark I heard. One remark I heard about that. It's just a little story about something that happened at the end user. In fact, they started promoting open source, so they had a team of young developers, very motivated, that came in and that brought open source to what I mean, they reached the objectives and everything went fine, but they were perceived by legacy teams and by many people in the company as a kind of rock stars with a lot of privileges, and the people were somewhat discouraged about that because they felt that their work was not recognized, and so be careful about that. I mean, it's not a big bang. It's something you have to put slowly and to I mean, don't. There can be that kind of problems when you implement an OSPO. So I just wanted to tell that story because it's. I found it insightful. I mean.
Thank you. One of the things that we've done quite successfully, I don't work for Orange anymore, just to be clear. One of the things that was done at Orange quite successfully that worked really well was the notion that the OSPO is at the same time a small core team, but more importantly, a larger network of ambassadors, or in Orange they were called reference. I don't know if they're still called reference. And what these people would do, they would be very local to the operational teams, whether that was development teams or whether that were other teams, maybe purchasing teams, or the whole range, or process time to market type teams. So having people who are local to your teams, they can feed upwards the needs and the pain points from these local operational teams, allowing the central organization to define its actions and priorities for a given period of time coming up. So it was a very useful mechanism, both as a way of diffusing policy and support, but also a way of bringing back upwards that from the ground grassroots feedback. So I think that's a very useful mechanism for having an OSPO that scales, because it allows you to be flexible and have that top-down and bottom-up approach to what's going on.
Quickly, please. Sure.
Also remember that the reason a lot of times we focus on strategy first is I've helped 4 different companies go from proprietary to open source, and all of those were very strategic decisions and were powered top down, not bottom up. And so you have things where you have one gateway, which is through usage and realizing, oh gosh, now we have to do compliance, and then you have thinking a little bit more strategically in that coming top down. I have to admit, I'm a little bit more biased towards top-down because it's easier than the other slog that you have to go through. And it's ideal when you have like the situation at PayPal where it was both directions, where you have the bottom and you have the top, and then you have to worry about educating the middle management.
Yes, and you set up an education group.
Middle management is often the tricky layer.
Middle management will kill things.
It's
if you don't bring them in.
It's a wrap-up. I think we are out of time. Thank you very much. That was great.